Greetings, students, and welcome to Learning Unit number 2. We're going to spend a little bit of time today talking about race, racism, and white privilege. So buckle your seatbelts and let's go for the ride. So before we get started, I do want to just kind of make you aware of some things for just the sake of transparency. So before we get into this dialogue, I want to do a couple of things first. One is to kind of assure you that some of the information that you'll be hearing today will be the first time that a lot of you have heard this information. It'll be a little bit hard to digest and will create some discomfort. And so as a result of that, or prior to that, I just want to kind of pre-warn you about these particular things. And to help me do that, I enlisted the help and use of a model that one of my colleagues at St. Cloud State University, Sheila Mulready, actually developed just to kind of walk us through what that process may look like. So it works a little bit like this. So initially, and for a lot of people, these are the stages of grief that folks go through when you're exposed to a pretty traumatic set of circumstances or information that you receive. So we'll walk through them slowly. So as we talk about some of these complex topics like race, racism, and white privilege, the initial response might be for newer folks who've not heard this information before, is to go to this place called denial. And so that's really a line of thinking that this just isn't real. Why did I not know about it before now? I don't believe that it exists, and this is a hoax. So that's a place, or that's one of the stages that folks will go through as they experience some of the conversation that we're about to have as we dig deeper into these phenomena. Secondly, it's not uncommon that people feel angry, regardless to where you are on either side of the issue, and that, you know, for many of you who are going into the field of social work to look at trying to make life circumstances better for people, it seems almost counterintuitive to recognize that white privilege plays a role in one's life. And how could I, who have never been racist towards anyone, have this be a part of this whole white privilege process? So anger is a normal, typical response. Typically, after people have thought about it for a while, we go into this place called bargaining, where, you know, we're feeling like white privilege belongs to other folks. It has nothing to do with me. I may in fact be white, but it's for people who really don't get it, or recognizing the fact that my ancestors were poor immigrants as well. It had nothing to do with slavery or genocide. So that's the bargaining phase that folks will find themselves in as they're kind of venturing through this journey. The final two steps of this particular model, and I want you to pay close attention to, the D for depression. So typically after these type of exercises or these types of reading or these types of self-exploration, there tends to be this extreme sense of guilt and shame that you participate in a system that actually hurts others. Feeling helpless because you don't feel like you in of yourself can change privilege. So I would encourage you to take care of yourself and just to take the information as it's presented. And to recognize that guilt or shame has really never done anything to right the wrongs as it relates to white privilege and race and racism. And then the final step is moving towards acceptance, or recognizing that white privilege is a part of oppression, and for you to make a personal decision either to or to not to fight racism and other forms of systemic oppression. So I wanted to share that piece with you also, and acknowledge and recognize that as an African-American instructor, it might be easy for people to come to the conclusion that this is a format that I might use to expound my principles or my beliefs or about this very difficult subject matter. And I want to assure you that I've been doing this type of work for a very, very long time, and realize that that comes to that does not have a positive outcome. So I'm being transparent with you, and the information that I share with you has been researched information. So nothing that's made up for me for any personal gain other than for you all to have a better understanding of the playing field that you'll be working on as you are engaged in social work. At any point in time where I have opinions, I will definitely express what those are in terms of my own personal beliefs, but I will let the research speak for itself and encourage you to continue to read and study on your own. All right, so now that we've got the preliminaries out of the way, let's get to work. It's important for us to really understand definitions, and we hear words a lot of times, and sometimes we mix up the meaning or we don't exactly understand how they connect to each other. So I thought it'd be important before we got into the deeper parts of the conversations to really start to identify some really important concepts, because I think once you're able to figure out how they all tie together, then you'll have a better understanding of how this system actually works. So the first definition that we need to talk about is prejudice. And so as you can see here, it's an affective feeling towards a person or group based on that person's group membership or behavior. The word is usually referred to as preconceived, usually unfavorable feelings towards people or another person. So in other words, when we think about prejudice, it's an affective. It affects your emotions. So it really dictates how I feel about something based on my own experiences with it, based on my upbringing, based on things that I've been taught, based on the things that I believe to be fair or just in this world. So prejudice, that affective feeling, and we all have some forms of prejudice as it relates to. And the other root word for prejudice is to prejudge. So to already make assumptions about things rather than having the information all at the same time to come to a reasonable conclusion. So let's pay attention and remember that particular definition. So when we think about tying the definitions together, so we just talked about what prejudice is, and it's that effect and that feeling. So prejudice is usually the precursor to this definition, and that's the discrimination. So it consists of treatment of an individual or group based on their actual or perceived membership in that particular group or social category. It also goes on to say, Cambridge states, that in a way that is worse than the way that people are usually treated. And so when we think about discrimination, we're moving from an affective piece of prejudice to an actual action step of treatment. So now there are things that we do that have an impact on others. And so some of the things that we have in our society, and we'll be talking about some of those in greater detail as we move through this class, are below. We can see that age, color, criminal records, height, disabilities, ethnicity, family status, gender identity, generation, genetic characteristics, marital status, nationality, race, religion, sex, and sexual orientation are just a handful of the ways that people are treated differently based on where they land in any of these particular areas. So to keep that in mind, again, prejudice is the affective feeling, the thing that triggers us that we may have learned from wherever we've learned it from. And that manifests itself in terms of differential treatment based on any number of different things, based on our own belief system, our own ideology. So we need to keep those pieces clear. So now that we understand that, let's just talk about race for just a moment. And so race is a very, very, very complex set of circumstances. It's a very complex subject, because when you start to look at and try to identify, well, what are we trying to say when we're talking about race, it covers so many different grounds. I'll try to attempt to hit on a few of those, and we'll encourage you to do some continuing research your own to really get a sense of what we were talking about when we do talk about race. Bradshaw basically says that it's a way that we group human beings based on shared physical characteristics as well as social qualities in terms of that particular category, and then how they're viewed by society. So grouping folks together. People are Native American, they're Latino, they're European American, they're African American, they're Native American. And so we group people based on those social qualities as well as those shared physical characteristics and categories. There's also another actual definition of race, and this particular definition is a social political construct. So in other words, we've taken what our knowledge is about these groupings of individuals and we've started to actually assign various political and social contexts or constructs to them. And typically we need to understand also that this idea of race as a social and political construct was really developed by white folks in terms of those with institutional power to create a system of hierarchy based on superior to inferior. And underneath here, as we can see, when things were put into place, whites who actually created the system naturally were on top. Folks who were Black and Indian were pretty much at the bottom. Your Asian, Japanese, Irish, Italian, and Jewish were ranked below the Europeans, but then again above Blacks and Indians. And so when we think about the development of this country, as we talked about last week a little bit in terms of the colonization, as people immigrated to this country, they were assigned a category or they fell into a different place. And again, that has a lot of determinants in terms of how things are accessed and how things play themselves out. So when we talk about racism, we're talking about this discrimination and prejudicial treatment of a racially different minority group or communities of color. The one thing that you can pretty much guarantee yourself or know, and this may come as a surprise to many of you, but for communities of color, it is not a surprise, that during the course of our lifetime, often on multiple occasions, we will experience discrimination and prejudicial treatment. It's just a part of being a member of a community of color. So know that. That's one of the things that racism in and of itself, one of the consequences is that folks who are born into this world of color have additional burdens that they will have to actually deal with. We also have institutional racism. So we've got a pattern of racial discrimination that are entrenched in our societal structures and institutions. So when we start to think about the major institutions in our country, we have things like housing, we have medical insurance, we have educational processes, we have law enforcement, we have any number of different things that we all have to interface with at some point in time. So if we go back to the beginning and we have the folks who have the institutional control being people who have an ideology that discrimination or the differential treatment of people based on race is actually okay and something that we should all be on board with, then chances are they're going to make rules, policies, and regulations that really uphold those particular viewpoints, either in very intentional ways or even in unintentional ways. And so when we have those systems that are going on, whether they be in government, whether they be in retail or commerce, we have what's called institutional racism. So again, this pattern of discrimination is just a part of what happens in these larger institutions. So segregated housing policies. So things like the behavior of the judicial and law enforcement system as they interface on occasions with communities of colors, or prejudicial images that are shown in the media. Because if we think about who runs the media, who owns the media, it is those folks with ideological influence and power, as well as finance, and they dictate what's shown, what's not shown, and how it's shown, and the spin that's put on it. So when we think about institutional racism, it's perpetuated. It goes from a micro level to a meso level to a macro level in fairly short order. So making sure that we understand that. And then we also need to think about this as well. There's this notion called scientific racism. And so back in the 16th and 17th centuries, when people were starting to look at more scientific means of understanding the world around us and understanding each other, there arose these train of thoughts, eugenics movements, Charles Darwin, um, evolutionary theories, survival of the fittest, Sam Morton, who did craniometry, where he actually, as a researcher and scientist, ordered skulls from different races from different parts of the world, and based on the measurements of the skulls, made some determinations about who had more intelligence based on skull size and skull capacity. Now, this has gone on, as we've known nowadays, in terms of further research to recognize this is pseudoscientific. And so they were in the process of trying to actually demonstrate that there was empirical evidence that supports and justifies racism, as well as racial inferiority, discrimination, or superiority. Basically, skulls from European Americans were larger, and so the thought at that time was that larger skull had larger brain capacity, which meant that there was more intelligence. So again, as we think about this, we think about how racism has manifested itself in our community and our world, and there needed to be some justification for how we're able to treat people different, how we're able to make distinctions about various communities of color, why it's okay to take native land, why it's okay to enslave folks, why is it okay to do any number of things that were done for the sake of the growth of this country, was based on really bad science. We also need to understand that we step away from the macro for a moment. We also recognize that racism exists in these particular capacities either as we start to drill down further. So we have the notion of symbolic racism. And these are individuals who just don't perceive themselves to be racist, but they justify their negative judgment by asserting that others don't abide by traditional values of the dominant group. So in other words, I'm not like the rest of the other white folks. I'm different somehow in terms of that whole piece. So we think about that as one way that racism plays itself out. And you have adverse racism. These are individuals who attest to the importance of fairness, equality, justice, but their conduct is otherwise. So I might believe in my heart of hearts that we all need to treat each other the same way and we're all equal, but my conduct really doesn't support that. So if I allow, for example, if I'm a Caucasian person and I believe that this is true and I experience or I see an injustice that's happening for a person of color that I may know or not know, and I make the choice to not involve myself or to not try to right that particular wrong, then that's an example of adverse racism. So I get it, and I know that it shouldn't be that way, but I don't need to necessarily personally commit to doing anything differently. And then micro inequities. So comments, when you're in school assignments, tone of voice when you're speaking to another person, the lack of acknowledgement of people in meetings, or the gatherings applied to people of color. So, there people are in meetings and, there might be a Latino woman sitting at the table with a ton of folks who are white, and she may make a suggestion about this is what I think we need to actually do. And that conversation continues, and it doesn't get acknowledged. It doesn't get contributed into the conversation. And later in the conversation, before the end of the meeting, some person, of majority culture makes a comment, the same comment in a different way, and it gets acknowledged. So those are little micro inequities that folks experience by being invisible, even when they're actually in the room. So just to recognize that racism manifests itself, which is why it's so complex, in so many different ways in terms of how it plays itself out for us. Now, this was an interesting cartoon that I found that I thought did a nice job of actually kind of summarizing the history of Black and white relationships in the United States. And so as you can see, by taking a look here at this cartoon, I'll give you a minute or two to kind of look at some of the verbiage. It's kind of rings true also. oftentimes people think that when we talk about race and racism, that we're specifically talking about the African American community and the white community. And I also want to just kind of move that notion to actually let you know that when we're talking about issues around racism, it's really, two camps. You've got the dominant white community and you've got other persons of color. And it becomes very, very pervasive, even in terms of how forms of racism get played out even in those communities of color, based on this model that we are experiencing and learning about as it relates to how racism manifests itself. So let's talk about privilege. Let's talk specifically about white privilege. And so a few different definitions that I was able to find that put some context. And I recognize that for my students who may be of European descent, that this may be a little hard to stomach or to fathom. And so I would ask you at this time to really kind of, as you look through the definitions and hear the conversation, is to really be open to looking at what if this is accurate? What if this is really happening? Because the reality is that, in my opinion, it really is happening. So when we define it, it talks about an inherent advantage possessed by a white person based on their race in society, characterized by racial inequity and justice. Dr. McIntosh says it probably best. It's an invisible pack of unearned assets, which I count on cashing in each day, but which I was meant to be oblivious to. So a lot of the times when the conversation about white privilege comes up, it becomes hard because it's meant to be invisible, or the way it's been designed and socialized into our society is that people who have it don't even recognize it. But the people who don't have it recognize it immediately. And so when you start to look at other oppressed groups and communities of color, it's a collection of benefits based on belonging to a group perceived to be white, when the same or similar benefits are denied to other members of this particular group. So having white skin color comes with assets. If you can remember from the first module where there was this video called Checking Your Privilege done by Black Cat, she talked about just kind of how we find ourselves in this world of privilege, and we're born into this world of history. And so we need to recognize that this is a real process, and it's also a byproduct of this racialized society that we live in. And so when the decision was made to do a hierarchy as it relates to race, whether it was accurate or not, and assign value, and social, political, and ideological meaning to it, then one of the side effects is white privilege. And so if you are a person of color, this is something that in your lifetime you will never get to experience. This particular cartoon really kind of illustrates the point quite nicely. And so as you look here and see that in the course of the life that we live, we all have to go this course. There's things that we have to do in terms of being able to survive, whether it's be in education, going to school, finding jobs, being able to raise and take care of our families. And so we all have the same journey that we're on. But when you start to look at it from the racialized lens of how our society is actually structured, then this is what it actually looks like for many communities of color as we start to run this particular race. As you can see, the white male has a much clearer path than the African American female. And so it won't be of any surprise when we get to the end or the finish line who will more than likely be in first, and how life has been structured for those particular individuals to be in first. So basically, if you are able-bodied, white, Christian, male, that's educated, that's literate, and that has money, then you'll have a different experience in this country than anyone else. And so we need to really understand that process as well. So just as a means of a brief recap, I just wanted to kind of talk about what we just talked about. And you can always play the video back if there are things that you missed or want further information on. First, that race and racism are complex and difficult topics. So let's just put that on the table right away. We also need to understand that ideology drives the meaning of racism and it promotes racism. Also understanding that the concept of race as a social political construct was actually developed by white folks with the intent of creating a hierarchy in which they actually found themselves on top. Racism can be defined in many ways. It can be biological, or race can be biological. It can be categorical. It can be systemic. It can be institutional, as well as it can be subtle, adverse, as well as manifest itself through microaggressions. And that white privilege is a real concept, and it's something that we need to come to grips with, I think, as a country, as we move forward in terms of a lot of the work that we need to do to move things forward. So this pretty much brings to an end my presentation around the concepts of race, racism, and white privilege. I would encourage you all to continue to read and do the research on your own. Don't just take my word for it. I would also have you to look at the readings for this particular week and read those as well as the assignments that will be attached. So thank you, and I look forward to seeing you again on next week.